He pulled the scalpel out of the patient's open chest, turned around, and drove it straight into the nurse standing beside him. Once, twice, 3 times, 4, 5. Dr. Gregory Holt, the most powerful man in that hospital, stabbed Sarah Calloway 5 times in the middle of an open-heart surgery while the patient still lay bleeding on the table. He did it in front of 6 witnesses. He did it under lights bright enough to see every drop of blood hit the floor. And he did it without knowing one single, devastating thing. The woman he just tried to murder, her husband owned every wall, every floor, every chair Gregory Holt had ever sat in. And right now, that husband was watching it happen on a security camera feed from the parking lot outside. If this story doesn't make your blood boil, nothing will. Stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens next is something you will not see coming. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning Sarah Calloway walked into Mercy General Medical Center for what would become the worst day of her life, she kissed her husband on the cheek and said something she had never said before. "Daniel, if anything happens today, check the green folder in the bottom drawer of my desk. The locked one." Daniel Calloway looked up from his coffee. He was a quiet man by nature, methodical, the kind of person who noticed small things and filed them away without comment. But something in the way she said it made him set his mug down. "What do you mean, if anything happens? It's Wednesday, Sarah." She held his gaze for just a second longer than normal. Then she smiled, picked up her bag, and walked out the front door of their house in Lincoln Park. That was 6:52 in the morning. By 9:20, she would be on the floor of operating room 7 in a pool of her own blood. But to understand how a surgical nurse ends up fighting for her life in the middle of a coronary bypass, you have to go back 4 years. You have to go back to when Mercy General was about to die. The hospital had been hemorrhaging money for 3 years straight. Equipment was failing. 3 senior surgeons had walked out in the span of 18 months. The building's east wing had been condemned by a city inspector and shuttered. The board of directors held emergency meeting after emergency meeting, and after every single one, the conclusion was the same. They needed a cash infusion, and they needed it immediately, or Mercy General would close its doors before the end of the fiscal year. That's when Daniel Calloway stepped in. Not publicly, not with a press conference or a ribbon cutting or his name on a plaque. Daniel had made his money in medical supply logistics, building a distribution network that served hospitals across the Midwest. He was successful in the way that quiet people sometimes become successful, steadily, without fanfare, without anyone paying much attention until suddenly the numbers were enormous and the name behind them was still unknown. He believed that real power didn't announce itself, so when he invested $42 million into Mercy General, he did it through a holding company called Stillwater Capital Group. The board knew. His attorneys knew. That was the complete list of people who knew. Sarah had been working at Mercy General for nearly 2 years before she even mentioned to a colleague that she was married. She never wore expensive jewelry. She drove a 7-year-old Subaru. She showed up before her shift started and left after it ended. And in that building, she was simply Sarah Calloway, surgical nurse, one of the best they had. And that reputation was exactly what put her in the same operating room as Dr. Gregory Holt. Holt had been brought in 14 months after Daniel's investment, hired by the board to turn the hospital around. On paper, he was extraordinary. Revenue increased 30% in his first year. New departments opened. Mercy General climbed 11 spots in regional hospital rankings. The mayor shook his hand at a charity dinner. A medical journal ran a profile calling him the man who saved a Chicago institution. He was 54 years old, silver-haired, charming in the way that very dangerous people sometimes are. He had a handshake that made donors feel important and a voice that made staff feel heard. He was, by every visible measure, exactly what Mercy General needed. The rot underneath didn't show itself right away. It never does. Sarah first noticed something wrong on a Tuesday afternoon, 8 months before the day everything exploded. She was restocking a supply cabinet on the third floor when she realized an entire case of surgical-grade hemostatic agents was missing. Not misplaced, not delayed, gone. The delivery log showed it had been received. The loading dock receipt was signed, but the supplies were not in the cabinet, not in the overflow storage, not anywhere on the floor. She filed a report with the Materials Management Department. 3 days passed. Nobody responded. She followed up in person. A man behind a cluttered desk told her the report was under review. She asked what that meant. He didn't answer. 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time it was a shipment of cardiovascular sutures, a full pallet, signed for, logged in, and then simply absent from every storage room in the surgical wing. Sarah filed a second report, and a third, and a fourth. The responses, when they came at all, were polite non-answers. Under review. Being investigated. We appreciate you bringing this to our attention. She brought it to her supervisor, a woman named Linda Graves, who had been a nurse at Mercy General for 22 years and had seen the hospital at its worst and fought to keep it running through 3 different CEOs. Linda was the kind of woman who gave you the truth without softening it. And when Sarah walked into her office and laid out what she had found, Linda listened carefully, then stood up and closed the door. That was the first sign. Linda never closed her door. Sarah, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it. Sarah frowned. Okay. Linda sat back down and pressed her fingers against the edge of her desk like she was steadying herself. Don't dig into this. Why not? We're missing critical supplies. Patients could be affected. I know they could, but the people responsible for those supplies, they report directly to Holt, and Holt doesn't like questions. Sarah stared at her. What does that mean? Linda exhaled slowly. It means that in the last 14 months, 3 people in this hospital raised concerns about inventory discrepancies. One was transferred to a night shift at a satellite clinic 40 miles away. One was let go in a performance review that nobody saw coming. And one, a resident named Aaron Cole, filed a formal complaint with the compliance officer. Sarah didn't say anything. What happened to him? Linda's jaw tightened. He was found in violation of a controlled substance policy. Random drug test. Positive result. Aaron Cole had been clean for 31 years. He was fired within 48 hours. The compliance officer who received his initial complaint was transferred out of the department 2 weeks later. The office was very quiet. Sarah sat there with her hands flat on her thighs, absorbing that. Linda looked at her. I'm not telling you this to scare you. I'm telling you because I care about you. Whatever is going on with those supplies, it is bigger than a few missing boxes. And the people protecting it are not afraid to move fast. Sarah nodded slowly. She said, okay. She meant it, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Because 4 days after that conversation, a patient named Walter Grimes, 68 years old, a retired high school basketball coach with 3 grandchildren and a laugh you could hear from 2 rooms away, went into surgery for a routine mitral valve replacement. The surgical team, halfway through the procedure, discovered something that should have been impossible. The replacement valve, a critical device that should have been factory sealed and current, was defective. Not damaged, not old. Defective in the specific way that means recalled. The FDA had pulled it from the market 7 months earlier. It should never have been in that operating room. Walter Grimes died on the table. Sarah was standing 6 feet away when the monitor flatlined. She watched the surgeon call time of death at 11:47 a.m. She watched the anesthesiologist remove the breathing tube with hands that weren't quite steady. She stood there holding Walter's chart, and she made a decision that would cost her almost everything. She was going to find out exactly what was happening in this hospital, and she was not going to stop until she had something so solid that nobody could make it disappear. Over the following 4 months, Sarah Calloway quietly became something no one expected. She became a forensic investigator in scrubs. She had no training in finance. She had no background in law or auditing. What she had was 12 years of nursing, which meant she was meticulous, systematic, and deeply comfortable with the idea that small details add up to big truths. She started with the supply chain. She pulled invoices during lunch breaks, photographing them with her phone. She compared purchase orders against delivery confirmations and cross-referenced serial numbers on equipment with the FDA's public manufacturer database. She worked slowly, carefully, always using access she was legitimately authorized to have as a senior surgical nurse. And what she found made her physically sick. Gregory Holt had constructed a network of shell companies. 4 of them were registered in Delaware, 1 in Nevada, and 1 offshore in the Cayman Islands. Hospital funds earmarked for surgical supplies were being routed through these companies in the form of invoices for equipment that never arrived. The supplies that did arrive were another story entirely. Some were substandard products purchased at a fraction of cost and billed to the hospital at full price. Some were expired items that had been repackaged with new labels and new printed expiration dates. And some, like the valve that killed Walter Grimes, were recalled devices purchased from a secondary broker and reintroduced into the supply chain as current inventory. Gregory Holt was pocketing the difference. Not thousands, millions. Sarah documented every single piece of it. She photographed invoices. She saved copies of shipping manifests. She recorded timestamps. She cross-referenced warehouse receipts. She built a file that could have been handed to a federal prosecutor without a single revision. She kept it all in a green folder in a locked drawer in her desk at home. And she told Daniel none of it. Not because she didn't trust him. She trusted him with her life. But she knew her husband. She knew that if Daniel found out what Holt was doing inside a hospital that Daniel quietly owned, he would not go through proper channels. He would burn the entire operation to the ground overnight, and the chaos of that would give Holt's lawyers exactly the opening they needed to discredit the evidence, muddy the timeline, and walk away clean. Sarah wanted justice that lasted, the permanent kind, the kind built on evidence so overwhelming that no firm, no board member, no public relations team could put a hand up and make it go away. So she kept working. She showed up to her shifts. She assisted in surgeries. She smiled at Gregory Holt in the corridor and said, "Good morning, Dr. Holt." And he nodded back at her without a flicker of concern, because to him she was exactly what she appeared to be, a nurse doing her job. He should have looked more carefully. The man who finally noticed Sarah was not Holt. It was his head of procurement, a 50-year-old former hospital administrator named Dennis Core. Core had been with Holt since before Mercy General. He was the architect of the shell company structure, the one who had set up the vendor accounts, forged the delivery confirmations, and managed the paper trail with the kind of precision that comes from having done something criminal long enough to get very good at it. On a Monday morning, Core walked into Holt's office without knocking and sat down across from him. "We have a problem." Holt didn't look up from his monitor. "What kind?" "A nurse on the surgical floor, Sarah Calloway. She's been pulling invoices, purchase orders. She accessed the equipment tracking database twice last week using a coworker's login credentials." Now Holt looked up. His eyes were flat and still in the way that very controlled people's eyes go flat when they're processing something dangerous. "How long has she been doing this?" "Weeks, maybe longer. She's not being casual about it, Gregory. She's building something." Holt leaned back in his chair. "What does she have?" "I don't know for certain, but she's systematic, cross-referencing, not just browsing. She knows what she's looking for." A long silence. "Who is she?" 7 years at Mercy General. Outstanding record, no disciplinary history. Holt's fingers moved once on the armrest. "Married?" Yeah, husband's some kind of tech investor. Nobody. Holt almost smiled at that. He leaned forward. Handle it. Performance review. Policy violation. I don't care what you use, just make it clean and quiet. Cor stood up and started for the door. Then Holt's voice stopped him. Wait. Cor turned around. Don't move on her yet. Let her keep digging. I want to know exactly what she has and who she's talking to. And then, his voice dropped. We close the whole thing. Cor looked at him for a moment, then he nodded and left. That was 3 weeks before the surgery. During those 3 weeks, Holt had Sarah watched. Her email was monitored. Her badge swipes were logged and reviewed. Someone went through her locker on a Thursday afternoon while she was in a procedure. They found nothing because Sarah had never brought the folder to the hospital, but they found something else. On a Wednesday evening, Cor's IT contact flagged an encrypted outgoing message from an email address registered to Sarah. The encryption was strong, but they cracked enough of it to pull fragments. Financial discrepancies, diverted shipments, and a name, Holt's name. When Cor showed him the fragments, Gregory Holt read them twice in complete silence. Then he set the paper down with the careful precision of a man who understood that the next decision he made was going to define the rest of his life. Who did she send it to? We can't trace the recipient. The encryption's too strong. Could be a lawyer, could be law enforcement. Holt stood up from his desk so suddenly that his chair rolled back and hit the credenza behind him. He walked to the window. His breathing was controlled, but his shoulders were set in a way Cor had never seen before. She's trying to take me down. Cor said nothing. She's on my surgical team Thursday morning. Cor went very still. Gregory. She made a fatal mistake, Dennis. She picked a fight with the wrong man in the wrong building. Listen to me. Whatever you're thinking, there are other ways to handle this. Holt turned around. His voice was quiet now in a way that was worse than shouting. Are there? She's already sent something outside this hospital. We don't know who received it. We don't know what they've done with it. If this surfaces, it's not just me. It's you. It's everything we built here. Cor's voice was almost a whisper. What are you thinking? Holt looked at him for a long moment. Accidents happen in operating rooms. A moment of confusion. An instrument mishandled under pressure. It happens. Cor felt his legs go weak under him. He had helped Holt steal millions. He had helped cover the death of a patient. But this was a different line entirely. That's murder, Gregory. That, Holt said quietly, is survival. Cor stood there. He wanted to say something that would change what was clearly about to happen. He opened his mouth and found nothing useful inside it. He walked out of the office, and Gregory Holt turned back to the window, and the city of Chicago spread out below him in the gray morning light, indifferent to everything he was planning. Thursday came the way terrible days always do, exactly the same as every other day, right up until it isn't. Sarah arrived at Mercy General at 6:45 a.m. She changed into her scrubs, checked the board, and headed to Operating Room 7 for a scheduled coronary artery bypass at 8 a.m. The patient was James Whitmore, 56 years old, a retired firefighter from Evanston, father of 4, the kind of man who still drove his elderly neighbors to their doctor's appointments because nobody asked him to, and he thought it was the right thing to do. Sarah had spoken with him briefly the evening before, during pre-op prep. He had shaken her hand and said, "I'm not scared." She had looked at him and said, "You don't need to be. You're in good hands." She had meant it. The surgical team assembled in OR 7 at 7:50. 2 assisting surgeons, Dr. Patricia Walsh and Dr. Kevin Bauer. Anesthesiologist, Dr. Nina Park. Scrub nurses, Janet Holloway and Marcus DeSoto. And at the head of the table, Dr. Gregory Holt, who walked in at 7:58, gloved and gowned, and looking, to every person in that room, exactly like every other Tuesday morning surgeon they had ever worked beside. Except Sarah. She noticed it immediately. His eyes, when they landed on her, were not right. They were too focused, and the focus was not on the patient, it was on her. A cold current moved through her, starting in her chest and traveling down her arms to her fingertips. She told herself it was nerves. She told herself it was the weight of 4 months of secrets pressing on her. She checked her instrument tray. She confirmed the equipment. She did her job. The surgery began at 8:04. For the first 42 minutes, it was textbook. Holt worked with the economy of motion that came from 20 years of surgical experience. He called for instruments in a flat, steady voice. He directed the team with the quiet efficiency that the best surgeons have, the kind that makes a procedure feel like something choreographed and inevitable. James Whitmore's vitals were stable. Everything was, by every available measure, fine. Then at 8:47, Holt extended his right hand without looking up. Fresh scalpel. Sarah reached for it, placed it in his palm, handle first, the way she had done 10,000 times before. He took it. He paused, and he looked at her. Not the brief professional glance of a surgeon checking his team. He looked at her with something in his eyes that she had never seen in an operating room before. And in the half second before he moved, she understood. She understood everything. She opened her mouth. She didn't get the word out. Gregory Holt turned his body away from the table and drove the scalpel into her abdomen with controlled, deliberate force. The sound she made was not a scream. It was a single, sharp intake of breath that didn't complete. Her hands went to her stomach. She felt the blade withdraw and felt it enter again, and then again. And the world became very bright and very loud, and then suddenly, very distant, and she was on the floor, and she didn't know when that had happened. 5 times. He had done it 5 times. She knew this because Janet was counting out loud as she pressed her hands against the wounds. And Janet's voice was the clearest thing in a room that had erupted into chaos, alarms and shouting, and the sound of someone hitting the emergency panel on the wall. Sarah heard Holt's voice above all of it, steady, almost calm. She should have minded her own business. Then she heard Marcus DeSoto hit the floor with Gregory Holt underneath him, and she heard Patricia Walsh screaming for the backup team over the intercom. And she heard Dr. Park's voice keeping James Whitmore sedated and stable while his chest was still open on the table. And she heard Janet very close to her ear saying her name over and over. Sarah, Sarah, stay with me. Sarah, look at me. And she tried. She tried to look at Janet. She tried to speak. She got 3 words. Green folder. Home. Then the lights in operating room 7 went very bright and then went away. 7 minutes later, she was in the ICU. Surgeons worked on her for 4 hours and 18 minutes. Lacerations to the liver. A punctured intestine. Blood loss severe enough that her heart stopped once on the table. They brought her back. And down in the parking lot of Mercy General Medical Center, a black sedan that had arrived 11 minutes after the emergency call was made sat with its engine running. The driver's side door open. Daniel Calloway stepped out. He was calm. That was what the security officer at the entrance desk would later describe to investigators. Not frantic, not crying, calm in the specific way that is far more frightening than rage. The calm of a man who has already decided what he is going to do and is simply in the process of doing it. He walked through the emergency entrance, past the waiting area, past the desk, and he stopped in front of the receptionist and said 2 things. My wife is Sarah Calloway. She was just brought in, and I would like someone to contact the chairman of your board of directors. Right now. The receptionist looked up at him. Sir, the chairman, I can't just... Daniel reached into his jacket pocket. He placed a card on the counter. The receptionist looked down at it. She picked it up. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked up the phone. The card read, Stillwater Capital Group, majority shareholder, Mercy General Medical Center. The color left her face like water draining from a glass. Gregory Holt was sitting in a security holding room on the 2nd floor with 2 Chicago police officers outside his door, still wearing his surgical gown, still with Sarah's blood on his gloves, telling anyone who would listen that it had been an accident, that his hand had slipped, that the nurse had moved into his operating field at a critical moment, that it was a tragedy. He had been saying these things for 40 minutes with absolute confidence, because Gregory Holt had spent his entire career being the most powerful person in every room he entered, and he had no reason to believe that today was any different. He had no reason to believe that the man now being escorted to the security office to view the footage from Operating Room 7 owned the building he was sitting in. He had no reason to believe that the woman he had just tried to kill had spent 4 months building a case against him, so thorough and so precise that even now, even unconscious in a surgical suite 2 floors above him, she had already won. He sat there in the blood-stained gown, and he told his story again, and he was still telling it when the board chairman knocked on the holding room door at 11:47 a.m. and said, "Dr. Holt, I need to inform you that the husband of the nurse you attacked is the majority shareholder of this hospital, and he is currently in the security office reviewing 17 minutes of uninterrupted footage from 8 different camera angles." Gregory Holt stopped talking. The room was very quiet, and for the first time since he had walked into Mercy General that morning as the most powerful man in the building, he understood that he was not that anymore. He might never be anything again. Daniel Calloway watched the footage twice. He didn't ask anyone to pause it. He didn't look away. He sat in the small security office on the first floor with the monitor in front of him and the hospital's head of security standing 3 feet behind him, and he watched his wife hand Gregory Holt a scalpel, and he watched Holt pause, and he watched him turn, and he watched every second of what came next. All 5 of them. When it was over, Daniel sat still for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then he said, "How many cameras cover that room?" 8. "And all of them were recording?" "Yes, sir. We confirmed it within the first 20 minutes. Daniel nodded once. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and said, "I want an emergency board meeting tonight. Every member present or on a screen, 8 o'clock. The security chief blinked. "Mr. Calloway, some of the board members are traveling. I don't know if we can—" 8 o'clock, Daniel said again quietly. He walked out of the security office and down the hallway toward the ICU, and nobody in the corridor said a word to him, because something in the way he moved made it very clear that the time for words had not yet arrived. It was 12:14 p.m. Sarah had been in surgery for just over 3 hours. The board chairman, a man named Thomas Reedy, who had been managing committees and navigating institutional politics for 30 years, found Daniel in the ICU waiting area at 12:40. Reedy had the look of a man who had spent the last 2 hours in a state of controlled panic and was doing a poor job of hiding it. He extended his hand. Daniel shook it. "Mr. Calloway, I want to start by saying, Thomas," Daniel's voice was even, "my wife is in surgery right now because a man you hired tried to kill her in the middle of an operating room. I don't need a statement. I need you to do 3 things. Make sure Holt doesn't leave this building. Make sure every piece of footage from OR7 is secured and copied. And get me every board member in a room tonight." Reedy nodded rapidly. Of course, all of that is already—" "And one more thing," Daniel looked at him. "Nobody in this hospital talks to the press, to Holt's attorneys, or to anyone outside law enforcement without running it through me first. Is that clear?" It wasn't a question. Reedy understood that. "Yes, sir." At 1:05 p.m., Chicago Police Detective Maria Voss arrived at Mercy General. She was 43 years old, with 17 years in violent crimes, and the particular kind of patience that comes from having interviewed people who believed their own lies for so long they couldn't find the seam anymore. She walked into the holding room where Gregory Holt was sitting with his attorney, a sharp-faced man named Craig Nolan, who had driven over from his River North office in under 20 minutes. Nolan had already advised his client to say nothing. Holt, to his credit, had listened. for about 4 minutes. Then he had started talking again, because Gregory Holt had spent 3 years being the man everyone in this building looked to for answers, and silence felt, to him, like surrender. Voss set a tablet on the table between them. She pressed play. She let the footage run without comment for the full 4 minutes and 22 seconds that it took to show what happened in Operating Room 7. When it ended, she looked at Holt. "Your hands slipped." Holt said nothing. 5 times. Still nothing. Nolan leaned forward. "Detective, my client, I'm not finished." Voss's voice didn't change pitch. She turned back to Holt. "Dr. Holt, I've been doing this job for 17 years. I've interviewed men who poisoned their business partners, men who staged accidents, men who hired other people to do their dirty work and then cried at the funeral. But I have never, in 17 years, seen someone attempt murder in front of 6 witnesses, under 8 cameras, during active surgery on an unconscious patient." She paused. "So I'm going to tell you what we found this morning before I came in here, and then you can decide how you want to spend the rest of your afternoon." Nolan put his hand on Holt's arm. Holt didn't look at him. His eyes were on Voss. "We executed a search warrant on your office at 11:30 this morning. We found a second set of financial records. We found a series of communications between you and your head of procurement discussing a surgical nurse named Sarah Calloway by name. And we found a text message sent from your personal cell phone at 6:09 this morning." She looked down at her notepad. "To Dennis Core, it reads, 'Today it ends. No loose ends.'" The air in the room changed in a specific way that Voss had felt before. The way it felt when a person who had been holding their story together heard the exact piece of information that told them it was already over. Holt's face went still. Not calm. Still. The way a pond goes still right before the surface breaks. Nolan turned to his client. "Richard, not one word." But Holt's hands, flat on the table in front of him, had started to shake. It was 1:38 p.m., and Daniel Calloway was sitting beside his wife's bed in the ICU, holding her hand. The surgeon who had operated on Sarah, a trauma specialist named Dr. Raymond Park, came out at 1:52, looking like he had aged 5 years in 4 hours. "Mr. Calloway," Daniel stood up immediately. "Tell me." Park exhaled slowly through his nose. "She's alive. We repaired the liver laceration and addressed the intestinal damage. We had one significant complication. She went into hemorrhagic shock on the table. Her heart stopped for approximately 40 seconds. We brought her back." Daniel's jaw moved once. "Is she going to be okay?" "The next 24 to 48 hours are going to be critical. There's risk of secondary infection, possible organ stress. She lost a significant amount of blood. But she's strong, and everything we saw in there tells me her body is fighting hard." Daniel nodded. "Can I see her?" Briefly, she sedated. He walked into the room. Sarah lay connected to monitors and lines, and the steady mechanical rhythm of the machines that were holding her in the world. She looked smaller than he had ever seen her look. He pulled the chair to the edge of the bed and sat down and took her hand in both of his. And for the first time since he had received the call in his car, the first time since he had sat in the security office and watched the footage, the first time since he had moved through this building making calls and giving instructions and keeping himself exactly where he needed to be, Daniel Calloway allowed his face to do what it had been doing underneath the whole time. A single tear ran down the side of his face. He leaned close to her ear. "I found the folder, Sarah," he said quietly. "I found everything. And I promise you, when you open your eyes, it is already done. He is finished." Her monitor beeped. Her chest rose and fell. He sat back in the chair and held her hand and waited. At 3:15 p.m., Dennis Kaur was arrested at his office on the 4th floor. He looked at the 2 federal agents standing in his doorway and said 4 words. "I want a deal." They put the handcuffs on him anyway. What happened next, In the 45 minutes between Core's arrest and the moment he sat down across from Special Agent Diane Kowalski at the FBI's Chicago field office, was the kind of capitulation that investigators train for and rarely got this fast. Core had been carrying the weight of what he knew for 3 years, and the moment he understood that Holt had crossed a line that no amount of financial engineering could paper over, that weight became too much to hold. He didn't wait for his attorney to finish reviewing the preliminary terms. He started talking while the attorney was still reading. It was Holt's operation from the beginning. I was 6 months into my job at Mercy General when he came to me. He said he had a system, a way to generate revenue off the supply chain. I thought he meant consulting arrangements, gray area stuff. I was wrong. Kowalski watched him without expression. Go on. He wanted vendor accounts that didn't exist, shell companies with real registration documents, real bank accounts, real invoice capabilities. The hospital would pay the invoice, the money would flow through the shell to an account Holt controlled, and he would take his cut. What was your cut? Core looked at the table. 15%. And Holt's? 60. The remaining 25 went to 3 other people in the building to keep the operation quiet. Names. Core gave them. Margaret Holloway, head of accounting, Vincent Pratt, who managed the offshore transfers, and a name that landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Dr. James Whitfield, a senior surgeon who sat on the hospital's equipment review board and had been signing off on fake requisitions for 14 months. Kowalski wrote each name down without visible reaction. The supplies, the expired equipment, the recalled devices. Core's face changed. His jaw tightened and his eyes dropped. That was Holt's call entirely. He found a broker, a man operating out of Indianapolis, who sourced recalled and expired medical devices at roughly 10 cents on the dollar. Holt had them repackaged with new labels and new printed dates and fed them back into the supply chain as current inventory. A patient died. Walter Grimes, yes. His voice cracked slightly on the name. I told Holt before it happened that we were going to get someone killed. He said the probability was negligible given the volume of supply. A 68-year-old man died on a table, and Holt described it as acceptable probability. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Kowalski said, "Tell me about Sarah Calloway." Core rubbed both hands over his face. She started asking questions about 8 months ago. At first I thought it was routine diligence, a thorough nurse doing her job well. But then she started pulling invoices, accessing tracking databases, cross-referencing serial numbers. She was building a case. I went to Holt about 3 weeks before the attack and told him she was digging. What did he say? He said let her dig. He wanted to know what she had before we moved on her. And then we intercepted a fragment of an encrypted email she'd sent outside the hospital network. It had his name in it. Financial discrepancies, diverted shipments. He lost it. Kowalski's eyes were level. He planned the attack in advance. The night before the surgery, he called me, late, almost 11 p.m. He said, tomorrow it gets handled. I asked what that meant. He said, don't worry about it. Just make sure the OR7 cameras have a technical problem in the morning. I called the IT supervisor, a man named Leo Park, and told him to run a diagnostic on the OR7 system at 8 a.m. That would have taken the cameras offline for about 20 minutes. Kowalski set her pen down. Did it? Cower's face went through something complicated. Leo forgot, or he got pulled into something else. I don't know. He never ran the diagnostic. The cameras stayed on. Every second of it is on tape. He looked up. I tried to stop it. Not the way I should have. Not the way I should have, but I tried. Kowalski looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Core, what you've described makes you an accessory to attempted murder in addition to the fraud charges. His attorney jumped in. Kowalski held up one hand without looking away from Core. I want you to understand something. The woman you helped target is in the ICU right now with 5 stab wounds and a liver that nearly gave out on the table. Your cooperation doesn't erase that, but it will be noted." She stood up. "Every name you gave me, I want full documentation. Bank records, communications, transfer logs, everything. You have 48 hours." She walked out and immediately called the lead prosecutor. By 4 p.m., Mercy General had become the center of a story that was spreading faster than anyone inside the building was ready for. A news van from a local CBS affiliate had parked outside the main entrance, then a second one from NBC, then a satellite truck from CNN. The story had broken on social media 40 minutes earlier, fed by a screenshot of the police activity that someone in the parking garage had posted from their phone. The board chairman, Thomas Reedy, stood in the administrative corridor with his cell phone pressed to his ear, and a look on his face that suggested he was reconsidering every career decision he had ever made. He called Daniel. "The press is outside, all of them. What do we tell them?" "Nothing tonight. Tomorrow morning we issue a statement that Holt has been removed effective immediately, that we are cooperating fully with law enforcement, and that an independent investigation has been opened. Nothing else." "Mr. Calloway, there are going to be questions about the ownership structure, about your relationship to the hospital. They're going to ask why—" "Thomas," Daniel's voice had not changed in temperature since that morning. "Tell them the hospital is cooperating with the investigation and that leadership is focused entirely on patient safety and the well-being of the staff. That's the statement. That's all of it." He hung up. At 6:47 p.m., Linda Graves, Sarah's supervisor, the woman who had told her 8 months ago to stop digging, walked into the office of the hospital's interim night administrator and placed a flash drive on the desk without sitting down. The administrator looked at it. "What is this?" "3 years of buried reports," Linda said. "Every complaint that got redirected. Every staff member who raised a concern and got transferred or let go. Every inventory discrepancy that was flagged and then disappeared. I've been keeping copies because I didn't know what else to do with them, and I was too scared to use them." The administrator stared at her. "Why now?" Linda's eyes were red and dry in the way that comes after crying has finished, and what's left behind is something steadier and harder. "Because a woman I told to stop fighting almost died today, doing what I should have done 3 years ago. And I'm done being afraid." She turned and walked out, and the administrator sat there looking at the flash drive for a long moment before picking up the phone. It was 7:40 p.m. The board meeting was in 20 minutes. Daniel came out of Sarah's room at 7:44. She had not regained consciousness. Her vitals had been stable for the last 2 hours, which the nurses described as encouraging, and which Daniel received the way he received everything that afternoon, quietly, precisely, filing it away. He walked to the elevator, pressed 6, and rode up to the executive conference room without looking at his phone, which had been ringing without stopping since shortly after noon. He had not answered a single call. He had not eaten. He had not sat down for more than the time he spent beside Sarah's bed. When the elevator opened on the 6th floor, he straightened his jacket and walked down the hall. The conference room had 12 people in it when he entered, and every face in it turned to look at him with some version of the same expression. A mixture of fear and guilt, and the desperate hope that this man, who had just watched someone try to murder his wife, was going to be the kind of person who could be managed. Daniel stood at the end of the table. He didn't sit down. He placed the green folder on the table in front of him. The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when everyone in them understands simultaneously that what is about to happen is not a conversation. It is a reckoning. "Most of you know me as Sarah Calloway's husband," he said. "Some of you know me as the majority shareholder of this institution. What none of you seem to know is that for the past 8 months, my wife has been conducting a solo investigation into the man you hired to run this hospital. She found enough to bring him down twice over, and this morning he stabbed her 5 times on an operating room floor because he found out she knew." Nobody spoke. I'm going to show you exactly what she found, and then we are going to make some decisions that are not going to be optional. He opened the green folder, and what came out of it was the end of Gregory Holt's world, one page at a time. The first document Daniel placed on the table was a purchase order dated 16 months earlier, $640,000. Vendor listed as a company called MedCore Solutions, LLC, registered in Wilmington, Delaware. He slid it toward Thomas Reedy without looking at him. MedCore Solutions does not exist. No office, no employees, no warehouse, no operating history. The registered agent is Dennis Corr, your head of procurement, who was arrested in this building 4 hours ago. He placed the second document beside the first, a delivery confirmation for that same order. Signed, time-stamped, logged into the hospital's inventory system as received in full. I had my team contact every medical supply distributor operating in the Midwest. No shipment matching this order was ever dispatched. The equipment was never purchased. The money left this hospital and went directly into a shell account. He put down a third document, then a fourth. Then he kept going. It was 8:09 p.m. For the next 26 minutes, Daniel Calloway stood at the end of that conference table and took apart 3 years of Gregory Holt operation with the methodical precision of a man who had spent the last 6 hours reading his wife's notes. 12 shell companies across 5 states. 1 offshore account in the Cayman Islands. $11 million in diverted hospital funds over 34 months. Forged invoices, ghost shipments, repackaged expired supplies fed back into surgical inventory as current stock. And then he placed down the last document, the purchase record for the defective mitral valve, the one that had been recalled by the FDA 7 months before Walter Grimes was placed on an operating table and trusted the people in that room with his life, the one that killed him. Daniel set it down in the center of the table and let the silence hold it. One of the board members, a woman named Patricia Holloway, who had been on the Mercy General Board for 9 years, looked at the document and pressed her hand over her mouth. Nobody else moved. Daniel looked around the room. My wife built this case alone, without institutional support, without telling me, without using my name or my resources. She went to work every single day standing next to the man who was systematically robbing this hospital, and she documented every piece of it because she knew that if she wasn't thorough enough, if she left a single gap, someone in a very expensive suit would find it and use it to walk away clean. He paused. She almost paid for that with her life. And now I need to know who in this room signed off on budget reports and financial summaries for the last 3 years without asking a single question about where the numbers came from. The room did not breathe. Board member Stephen Rourke, the group's legal counsel, cleared his throat. Mr. Calloway, I strongly advise that before we take any formal action, we retain outside counsel and you're going to vote to remove Gregory Holt as CEO of this hospital tonight, Daniel said. Effective immediately. You're going to suspend Dennis Corr and every department head whose name appears in that folder, and you're going to issue a full cooperation statement to law enforcement by 9 o'clock. Rourke opened his mouth. Daniel looked at him. Or I go public tomorrow morning with every document on that table, every name, every dollar, every death. And I let the press and the federal prosecutors decide who in this room knew what and when. He looked around slowly. All in favor of removing Dr. Gregory Holt as CEO, effective immediately. Every hand went up, every single one. It was 8:41 p.m. Downstairs in the holding room, Gregory Holt had stopped talking. His attorney, Craig Nolan, had finally gotten through to him on that point, and for the last 2 hours, Holt had been sitting in silence with his arms folded and his expression arranged into something that was supposed to look composed. It didn't. Detective Voss had come back at 7:30 with a second officer and a printed copy of the text message from Holt's phone, the one sent to Corr at 6:09 that morning. She had placed it on the table in front of him and said nothing. Holt had looked at it once and looked away. Nolan had said, "My client has no comment." Voss had said, "That's fine, the text comments for him." Then she had collected the printout and left. At 8:52 p.m., she came back a third time. She sat down. She placed a new document on the table. This one was a printed transcript of the first 20 minutes of Dennis Corr's interview at the federal field office. Holt looked at it. His eyes moved across the page slowly. Then they stopped moving. His jaw tightened. His arms, still folded across his chest, went rigid. Because what was on that page was not just a confession. It was a complete and detailed account of every conversation he had ever had with Corr about the operation, including the phone call the previous evening in which he had asked Corr to ensure that the OR7 cameras had a technical failure at 8 the following morning. Nolan leaned over and read it. Then he leaned back and was quiet for a long moment. "Richard," he said carefully, "I need you to listen to me very carefully right now." Holt was still staring at the transcript. "Richard." Holt's voice, when it came, was flat and strange. "He told them about the cameras." "Yes. I trusted him for 3 years." Nolan didn't respond to that. Voss watched Holt's face in real time as the architecture of the story he had been telling himself, the one where he was still managing the situation, still controlling the outcome, came apart entirely. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was quieter than that, and worse. The way a man looks when he realizes the thing he thought was a wall is actually a door, and it has been open the whole time, and everyone has already walked through it. She stood up. "Dr. Holt, you are formally under arrest for the attempted murder of Sarah Calloway. 3 counts of wire fraud, 6 counts of healthcare fraud, 2 counts of money laundering, 1 count of conspiracy, 1 count of distributing adulterated medical devices, and 1 count of involuntary manslaughter in the death of Walter Grimes." She read him his rights. He didn't speak. He didn't move until the handcuffs were placed on his wrists, and then he stood up slowly, like a man who had been sitting for much longer than 2 hours, like a man who was already exhausted by what was coming, and they walked him out through the hospital's service corridor. Word had already spread through every floor. Staff lined the hallway, nurses, orderlies, residents, technicians. They stood in silence and watched Gregory Holt, who 3 days ago had been the most powerful person in this building, walk past them in handcuffs with his head down. Nobody said a word. Nobody needed to. It was 9:17 p.m. Daniel was back in Sarah's room when his phone rang at 9:34. He looked at the screen, a number he didn't recognize, area code 202, Washington. He answered it. "Mr. Calloway, my name is Special Agent Diane Kowalski. I'm with the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division. I'm calling because approximately 40 minutes ago, we received contact from an attorney representing a woman named Rachel Torres, who works for a medical oversight nonprofit in Washington, D.C. Daniel was very still. "Ms. Torres states that 3 weeks ago she received a series of encrypted files from a nurse at Mercy General Medical Center. The files contain detailed documentary evidence of a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme involving your hospital's CEO." Daniel closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he opened them. "Rachel Torres," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. He knew. "Mr. Calloway, when Ms. Torres saw the news reports about the attack this afternoon, she did not wait for further instruction. She contacted her attorney, and her attorney contacted us. We opened a federal investigation 35 minutes ago." Daniel sat down slowly in the chair beside Sarah's bed. He looked at his wife's face. She had planned for this, all of it. She had sent copies of everything to a former colleague she trusted, and she had built a failsafe into the architecture of her investigation so that even if something happened to her, even if Holt moved against her and the hospital closed ranks and buried everything, the evidence was already outside the building and already in safe hands and already pointed directly at the federal government's front door. She had done all of that alone, without telling him, without asking for help. He put his hand over hers. "Thank you," he said to Kowalski. "I'll make certain you have full access to everything in this building." He ended the call and sat in the quiet room with the beeping monitors and his wife's steady, shallow breathing. And something moved through him that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but somewhere between the two. The feeling of a man who is beginning to understand the full dimensions of who he married. It was 10:08 p.m., and across town the case was about to grow in a direction nobody in that hospital had anticipated. At 10:22 p.m., FBI forensic accountants arrived at Mercy General and took possession of 3 years of financial records. They worked through the night. Kowalski's team cross-referenced Coor's testimony against the physical documents Daniel had presented at the board meeting. And by midnight, they had confirmed 14 shell entities, 11 million in diverted funds, and a supply chain fraud operation that had been running for 32 of the 38 months Holt had been CEO. But at 12:47 a.m., a forensic accountant named Tom Briggs found something that wasn't in Sarah's folder. It wasn't in any of the documents Daniel had presented. It was buried in the offshore accounts linked to Holt's Cayman Island shell. A series of payments that didn't match any hospital transaction. Regular, monthly, consistent, going to a single recipient, a biomedical research company called Viridian Sciences, registered in Zurich, Switzerland. Briggs stared at his screen for a moment, then picked up his phone and called Kowalski. "We've got something separate from the supply fraud. 18 months of monthly payments, between 25 and 40,000 each, going to a Swiss company called Viridian Sciences. In return, there are shipping records for small packages received at a private mailbox in Naperville." Kowalski was quiet for a moment. What was in the packages? Medical devices, unregistered, no FDA clearance, no clinical trial documentation, no regulatory approval from anybody, anywhere. The silence on the line stretched. "He was running an unauthorized trial," Kowalski said, "in an active hospital, on patients who had no idea." Briggs exhaled. "That's what it looks like." It was 1:04 a.m. At 1:31 a.m., Sarah Calloway opened her eyes. She didn't do it dramatically. There was no sudden awakening, no gasp. Her eyes opened slowly, like a woman surfacing from very deep water. And the first thing she saw was the ceiling of the ICU, which was exactly the kind of ceiling that tells you immediately where you are and why you'd rather be somewhere else. The second thing she saw was Daniel, asleep in the chair beside her, with her hands still in both of his, and his forehead resting against the edge of her bed. She looked at him for a long moment. Her throat was dry and raw from the intubation tube that had been removed 6 hours earlier. Her abdomen was a geography of deep, dull pain that she registered the way experienced nurses register pain, clinically, noting its location and intensity and filing it accurately. She tightened her fingers around Daniel's hand. He was awake before the second pulse. His head came up. His eyes found hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel's face did something that didn't have a name. "Hey," Sarah said. Her voice was almost nothing, barely a thread of sound. "Hey." He moved the chair closer and leaned forward. "Don't try to move. You're okay. You're in the ICU. You've been out for about 15 hours. She swallowed. It hurt. "James Whitmore, the patient on the table." Daniel nodded. "Dr. Walsh finished the surgery. He's in recovery. He's going to be fine." Sarah closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, something had settled in her face. The relief of that, the specific relief of a nurse who goes down in the middle of someone else's procedure and comes back not knowing if that person survived, was something Daniel had not seen on a human face before. It lasted about 4 seconds. Then her eyes sharpened. Rachel. "She contacted the FBI last night. They have everything. Federal investigation is open." Sarah exhaled very slowly. Her hand tightened again on his. Holt. Arrested, charged, removed by the board at unanimous vote. Core is cooperating. The FBI has the financials. Her eyes filled, not with sadness, with something closer to exhaustion and completion. The specific release of someone who has been carrying a structural load for so long that when it is finally taken away, the body doesn't know what to do with the space it leaves. A tear ran sideways across her temple and into her hair. She didn't wipe it. I wanted to tell you, she said. Every single day for 8 months, I wanted to pick up the phone and tell you what I found. I know. I couldn't, because if you had gone to the board even 2 weeks too early, before I had everything, they would have protected him. They would have buried it and moved on, and nobody would ever have known about Walter Grimes, and it would have happened again to someone else. Daniel looked at her. I know, Sarah. I'm sorry I kept it from you. Don't apologize to me. His voice was very quiet. Don't you dare apologize to me. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, There's something else, something that's not in the folder. He went still. There's a Swiss company, Viridian Sciences. I don't know if the FBI has found it yet. Daniel's expression changed. They found it an hour ago. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. Then they know about the devices. They know there were unauthorized shipments. They don't know what was done with them. Sarah tried to push herself up slightly and stopped when the pain registered. Daniel put his hand on her shoulder. Easy. There were 7 surgeries, she said. 7 procedures I assisted on in the last 9 months, where Holt used materials I could not identify. Implants, devices, things that weren't in any catalog I'd ever seen. I documented the dates and patient identifiers on pages 41 through 46 of the folder. She swallowed again. One of those patients, a woman named Carol Simmons, 63 years old, was readmitted 5 weeks later with unexplained cardiac inflammation. She's still being monitored. If what Holt installed in her is deteriorating, she may not know it. Daniel was already reaching for his phone. I'm calling Kowalski right now. And there's one more thing. He stopped. Sarah's voice dropped. The night before the surgery, I got a phone call. Blocked number. 11:47 p.m. The line was open for about 8 seconds. No one spoke. Then it disconnected. Daniel looked at her carefully. You think it was a warning? I think someone in this hospital knew what Holt was planning. Someone who couldn't go to the police and couldn't put it in writing, but couldn't stay completely silent either. Who? Sarah was quiet for a moment. Her eyes moved to the window and then back to Daniel. I think it was Linda. Daniel frowned. Linda Graves, your supervisor. She was the only person in this building who knew I was investigating. She warned me to stop 8 months ago. She was terrified, but she cared about me. And if she overheard something she couldn't prove, she wouldn't have gone to a detective. She would have called me from a blocked number in the middle of the night just to give me a chance to not walk through that door in the morning. Daniel sat with that. I'll find her. Be gentle. If it was Linda, she's been living with what happened all day. That kind of guilt, it does damage. He looked at his wife. She had 5 stab wounds, a repaired liver, and she was asking him to be gentle with the woman who might have known she was going to be attacked and couldn't make herself say the words in time to stop it. He squeezed her hand. I will. He pressed the call button and a nurse came in quickly, checked Sarah's vitals, adjusted her IV, and said in a tone that tried hard not to sound surprised, Your pressure is better than I expected. That's a very good sign. Daniel called Kowalski from the hallway. She answered on the second ring. He told her about Carol Simmons, told her about the 7 surgeries and the page numbers in the folder. Kowalski was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Mr. Calloway, if Holt was using unapproved devices on patients without their knowledge or consent, we are looking at charges that go significantly beyond the fraud and the attack. I know. This is going to expand the investigation substantially. It's going to take time, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. Daniel leaned against the wall. How many of those 7 patients do you think we're going to find in trouble? Kowalski's voice was careful. We won't know until we look, but we need to move tonight. You have full access to every system in this building, whatever you need. He ended the call and stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he went to find Linda Graves. He found her in the 3rd floor break room at 2:14 a.m., sitting alone at a small table with a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Her hands were wrapped around the mug. Her eyes were swollen and dry in the way that comes after a long time of crying, followed by the specific exhaustion that sets in when there are no more tears, but the reason for them hasn't changed. She looked up when he came in. The moment she saw his face, something in hers started to give. He didn't rush. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "How is she?" Linda said. Her voice was barely there. "She's awake. She's talking. The doctors say she's improving." Linda pressed her hand over her mouth. Her shoulders shook once, hard, and then she pulled them back. "She told me to be gentle with you," Daniel said. Linda looked at him. "Those were her words. She said if it was you who called, you're carrying a guilt that's eating you alive." The mug in Linda's hands trembled. "She said that. After everything she's been through today, that's what she said about you." Linda's face crumpled completely. The tears that had apparently not been finished came back, and she let them. And Daniel sat across from her and let the silence hold what needed to be held. When she could speak again, she told him everything. The cracked office door, the voice, the words. "She's on my table tomorrow. It ends tomorrow." She told him about standing in the corridor and listening, and going home and sitting on her couch until almost 2 in the morning, trying to convince herself she had misheard, that she was wrong, that the CEO of a hospital didn't say things like that about a nurse. She told him about the blocked call, the 8 seconds of open line where she had Sarah's voice in her ear saying, "Hello," and couldn't make her own voice work. She told him about arriving Thursday morning and seeing Sarah heading toward OR7 and smiling at her and saying, "Good morning," and watching her walk through the doors and feeling it in her gut, the specific animal certainty that she had just made the worst mistake of her life, and going to her station and starting her shift anyway, because 22 years of keeping her head down had made looking away feel like the only option available. Daniel listened to all of it without speaking. When she finished, he said, "Linda, what you overheard proves premeditation. It is the difference between attempted murder and attempted murder in the 1st degree. I need you to talk to Detective Voss tonight." Linda wiped her face. "I'll talk to her. I'll tell her everything." She looked at him. "The flash drive I gave to the night administrator. That's 3 years of buried reports. Every complaint that was ignored. Every person who tried to speak up and got crushed." Her voice was steady now, in the way that something goes steady after it has been broken and the pieces have been picked up and held deliberately in place. "I should have done it years ago. I should have been more like Sarah." Daniel looked at her for a moment. "You're doing it now," he said. "That counts." He called Voss from the hallway. She answered immediately. "Linda Graves, 3rd floor break room," he said. "She overheard Holt planning the attack the night before. She can testify to premeditation." Voss was quiet for exactly 1 second. "I'm on my way." Daniel put the phone in his pocket and stood in the empty corridor. The hospital was quiet around him. The press had gone home. The hallways were dim. Somewhere in this building, in a federal investigation that was now expanding by the hour, the full shape of what Gregory Holt had done was still revealing itself, layer by layer, like something that had been buried for a long time and was finally being brought to the surface. And 1 floor above him, Sarah Calloway lay in the ICU with her eyes closed and her vitals stabilizing. And somewhere inside the quiet of whatever she was dreaming, she was already thinking about what came next. Linda Graves walked into Detective Voss's temporary interview room at Mercy General at 2:47 a.m. and talked for 91 minutes without stopping. She gave Voss the words exactly as she had heard them through the cracked office door. "She's on my table tomorrow. It ends tomorrow." She described the phone call she had made from a blocked number at 11:47 p.m. The 8 seconds of open line, Sarah's voice saying, "Hello," and her own voice refusing to come. She described arriving Thursday morning and watching Sarah walk through the doors of OR7 and doing nothing. She said all of it without flinching, without softening the parts that made her look worst, because she had decided in that break room with Daniel Calloway sitting across from her that the only thing left worth doing was the full truth, delivered completely and without negotiation. When she finished, Voss turned off the recorder. "Miss Graves, what you've provided tonight establishes premeditation independently of the text message evidence and Carr's testimony. 3 separate sources pointing at the same conclusion." Linda nodded slowly. "What does that mean for the charges?" "It means Holt's attorney is going to have a significantly harder morning than he already had a significantly hard night." Voss stood up. "I need you to understand that you may be called as a witness in multiple proceedings. I strongly recommend you retain legal counsel before those conversations begin." Linda looked at her steadily. "I'll testify in open court, in front of him if I have to. I owe Sarah that much." Voss looked at her for a moment. "I'll be in touch." She walked out and immediately made 2 calls. The first was to the lead federal prosecutor. The second was to Kowalski. By 3:15 a.m., the premeditation case against Gregory Holt had 3 independent pillars, and not one of them was going to move. It was 3:22 a.m. on Friday morning. Holt had been in custody for 14 hours. At 4:11 a.m., Carol Simmons was called by a resident working the overnight shift on behalf of Dr. Helen Marsh, who had been appointed interim chief medical officer 6 hours earlier and had not slept since. The call was careful, professional, and deliberately vague on details. "We'd like you to come in for a follow-up imaging appointment at your earliest convenience." Carol Simmons, 63 years old, a retired elementary school librarian from Evanston, who had spent 40 years recommending books to children, and 30 of those years making absolutely certain her heart was behaving itself, said she would be there at 7. She arrived at 6:52. The imaging took 40 minutes. Dr. Marsh reviewed the results personally, and when she walked out of the reading room at 8:03, her face was doing the controlled, careful thing that doctors' faces do when the results are bad and the patient is waiting 20 feet away. She called Daniel from the hallway. "Mr. Calloway, the cardiac implant Holt placed in Carol Simmons is not only unregistered, it is actively failing. It's a synthetic polymer mesh that I have never encountered in any legitimate cardiac application. Microscopic fragments are detaching and entering her bloodstream. That is what caused the inflammatory response that brought her back to us 5 weeks ago." Daniel's jaw tightened. "How serious? If we don't remove it, she will likely develop systemic complications within 60 to 90 days, potentially fatal ones." "Operate. We're prepping now, but Mr. Calloway, I've reviewed Holt's surgical logs from the past 14 months. I've identified 2 other patients who received similar implants in procedures he performed." The silence on Daniel's end lasted 2 seconds. "Who?" "A 67-year-old man named Arthur Brennan and a 51-year-old woman named Maria Delgado. Both were discharged. I'm attempting to contact them now." "Find them," Daniel said, "whatever it takes." He ended the call and sat with that information for a moment. Then he walked back to Sarah's room. She was more alert than she had been at 2 in the morning. The sedation was thinning out of her system, and her eyes, when he came in, tracked him immediately and with purpose. "Carol Simmons," she said before he could speak. "They're operating now. Dr. Marsh is leading it." Sarah's eyes closed for a second. "I knew. The way he talked about her case afterward, there was something. He was too composed, like he was monitoring an experiment, not reviewing a complication." Daniel sat down. "Sarah, there are 2 more patients." Her eyes opened. He told her about Arthur Brennan and Maria Delgado. She listened without interrupting, which was how he knew she had already considered the possibility. Pages 43 and 45, she said. The dates and procedure codes are there. The device Holt used on Arthur Brennan was different from the one in Carroll. Smaller, vascular application. I couldn't find a catalog number for it anywhere. Daniel had already sent a message to Kowalski with the page numbers. His phone buzzed with her response before he put it down. She had the pages. Her team was cross-referencing them against the Viridian Sciences shipping manifests recovered overnight. She expected to have a full device inventory within 2 hours. Daniel looked at his wife. You documented all 7 surgeries. I documented everything I could access. The ones I'm certain about are on those pages. The others I saw things I couldn't confirm. Devices that looked wrong, materials that didn't match any standing order. I flagged them as potential in my notes. How did you know what to look for? Sarah was quiet for a moment. Because I spent 10 years in the ICU before I moved to surgical. And the patients who came through there after those specific procedures, 2 of them had inflammation markers that didn't match their surgical profiles. I noticed it because that's what ICU nurses do. We notice when something doesn't add up. I just kept noticing. It was 9:47 a.m. on Friday, 24 hours since Sarah had walked into OR 7. The Carol Simmons surgery took 4 hours and 38 minutes. She came out of it successfully. When she woke up and Dr. Marsh told her what had been inside her chest for the past 3 months, what it was doing to her body, and who had put it there without her knowledge or consent, Carol Simmons did not cry. She asked for a glass of water, drank half of it, set the cup down with great deliberateness, and said, I want to speak to an attorney today. Dr. Marsh said, I'll arrange it. Carol looked at her. How many other patients? Marsh hesitated. Carol's voice was steady. How many other people did he do this to? I want to know. Marsh told her about the 2 others being contacted. Carol nodded once. Tell them to call me, she said. After they've seen a lawyer, tell them they're not alone. Arthur Brennan came in voluntarily at noon. The imaging showed his unregistered vascular stent was structurally intact, but showed early material fatigue in 3 places. Not failing yet, but 4 to 6 months from failing, by Dr. Marsh's estimation. He sat in the consultation room after receiving those results and said very little for a long time. His wife, sitting beside him, held his hand with both of hers. Finally, he said, He put this in me on purpose. Marsh said, That's what the evidence suggests, yes. Arthur Brennan was 67 years old. He had worked 40 years as a union electrician, put 3 kids through college, and had never in his life hurt anyone on purpose. He looked at his wife. Then he looked at Marsh. Then I want to make sure every court that hears this case knows exactly what it felt like to sit in this room. Maria Delgado was harder to reach. She had moved to Phoenix 3 months after her discharge. Kowalski coordinated with a hospital there, and Maria was located and examined by early afternoon. The news was not good. The device Holt had placed in her was the same model as the one removed from Carol Simmons that morning, and it had been deteriorating for longer. Emergency surgery was scheduled for the following morning in Phoenix. She was 41 years old. She had 2 children. When the doctor in Phoenix explained the situation to her over the phone, she sat in the parking lot of the grocery store where she had just been running errands and didn't move her car for 45 minutes. It was 1:30 p.m. on Friday, and at the federal field office in downtown Chicago, the investigation had just taken its most significant turn yet. Kowalski's forensic accountant, Tom Briggs, had been working through the Viridian Sciences payments for 11 straight hours when he found the second layer. Viridian Sciences was not the originating entity. It was itself a shell, registered in Zurich, controlled by a parent company called Northfield Biomedical Group, incorporated in Frankfurt, Germany. And Northfield Biomedical Group was not a small operation. It was a mid-sized pharmaceutical conglomerate with subsidiaries across 8 countries. a legitimate public-facing research division, and a covert pipeline of unauthorized device trials that had been running in hospitals across 4 countries for 6 years. St. Matthew's in London, a private clinic in Warsaw, a cardiac center in Seoul, and Mercy General Medical Center in Chicago, Illinois. 7 sites total. Holt had not been an independent operator. He had been recruited. Northfield had approached him 18 months into his tenure at Mercy General, identified the hospital's financial vulnerabilities, and offered him a significant payment structure in exchange for running their unauthorized device trials through his surgical program. He had been paid not just to steal from the hospital, but to use its patients as unknowing test subjects for devices that Northfield could not get approved through legitimate regulatory channels. Briggs stared at his screen for a long time after confirming the connection. Then he called Kowalski. This is not a local fraud case anymore. Kowalski was quiet for 4 seconds. Send me everything you have. I'm calling Interpol in an hour. She called Daniel at 2:15 p.m. Mr. Calloway, the scope of this investigation has changed significantly. Holt was working with a German pharmaceutical company called Northfield Biomedical Group. They were running unauthorized device trials across 7 hospital sites in 4 countries. Your wife's investigation didn't just expose a corrupt CEO. It cracked open an international criminal operation that has been running for 6 years. Daniel sat with that. How many patients across all 7 sites? We don't know yet. That's going to take weeks to establish. But I want you to understand something. What Sarah found, what she documented, what she sent to Rachel Torres, is going to be the foundation of a federal case that will reach across international borders. What she did in that hospital is going to matter in ways that are still unfolding. Daniel looked at the wall for a moment. She needs to know that, he said. I'll tell her. He went back to the room. Sarah listened to everything he said. Her face was very still. When he finished, she looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she said, Northfield. He nodded. I saw their name once, in a packing slip that came with one of the shipments. It was partially obscured, and I thought it was a typo or a mislabeling error. I documented it on page 48. Daniel looked at her. Page 48. Bottom of the page. I wrote it as an uncertain notation. I didn't have enough to connect it to anything. He picked up his phone and texted Kowalski. Her response came back in 90 seconds. Page 48 confirmed, cross-referenced with Northfield shipping records recovered this morning. Sarah Calloway had documented the connection between Holt and Northfield Biomedical 4 months ago and hadn't known it. A partial packing slip notation in a green folder in a locked desk drawer in Lincoln Park had just become an evidentiary thread connecting a Chicago hospital fraud case to a 6-year international criminal enterprise spanning 4 countries and 7 institutions. Daniel showed her Kowalski's message. Sarah read it twice. Then she handed the phone back and turned her face toward the window, and she was quiet for a long time. Walter Grimes, she finally said. Daniel moved closer. He's part of it too, she said. Whatever Northfield was testing, whatever they were moving through that supply chain, Walter Grimes died in a hospital that was being used as a laboratory and nobody knew. Her voice was steady, but her jaw was tight. His family deserves to know that what happened to him is going to matter to more than just one case in one city. Daniel said, I'll make sure of that. At 3:45 p.m. on Friday, a woman knocked on the ICU waiting room door. Daniel looked up. He didn't recognize her. She was in her mid-50s, dark hair, eyes that had been red for a long time. Mr. Calloway, my name is Beverly Grimes. Walter was my father. Daniel stood up immediately. The name hit him with the weight of everything Sarah had told him, everything he had read in the green folder, the defective valve, the recalled device, the table, the flat line at 11:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning 4 months ago. Mrs. Grimes, his voice was careful. When my father died, they said it was a surgical complication. They said these things happen. They said his heart was weaker than the imaging suggested. Her chin was trembling, but her voice held. We believed them. We grieved. We moved on. And this morning I turned on the news. Daniel said nothing. She needed to finish. He taught mathematics at Lincoln High School for 31 years. He coached the debate team for 22 of them. He was at every one of his grandchildren's birthdays, every single one, until the last one he missed because he was dead. Her voice cracked on the last word and then recovered. And I need you to tell me that the people who did this to him are going to actually pay for it. Not a settlement, not a quiet agreement. I need to know they are going to stand in a courtroom and have to look at what they did. Daniel looked at her directly. They will. He said it with the specific certainty of a man who owns the building, who has the folder, who has already watched the board vote unanimously, who has already spoken to the FBI twice in the last 18 hours. Your father's death is in the federal case. The defective valve, the supplier, the money trail, all of it is documented. I give you my word that it will be presented in open court. Beverly Grimes held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once, and something in her face shifted very slightly. Not relief exactly, but the specific acknowledgement of a person who has been carrying a terrible weight and has just been told by someone credible that the carrying is not for nothing. Can I see Emily? The nurse. Her name is Sarah, Daniel said gently, and yes, when she's stronger, I'll make sure of it. Beverly left. Daniel stood in the waiting room alone for a long time after the door closed. He thought about Walter Grimes teaching mathematics for 31 years. He thought about the recalled valve, the 10 cents on the dollar broker in Indianapolis, the specific calculation Holt had made that a 68-year-old man's life was an acceptable variable in a profit equation. He thought about Carol Simmons lying in a recovery room 2 floors up, with fragments of an illegal device removed from her chest. He thought about Maria Delgado sitting in a parking lot in Phoenix for 45 minutes, unable to start her car. He thought about 7 hospital sites across 4 countries and an unknown number of patients who had gone to sleep trusting someone and woken up with something inside them that was never supposed to be there. And then he went to find Dr. Marsh. It was 4:52 p.m. He found her in her temporary office on the administrative floor, surrounded by surgical logs and device records. A woman who had not sat down for more than 5 minutes at a stretch since assuming the interim CMO role 14 hours ago. She looked up when he came in. How many? He said. No preamble. Marsh understood the question. We've reviewed the logs for the past 14 months. I'm confident about the 7 Sarah identified. There are 3 additional procedures I want to look at more closely, where device documentation is incomplete or inconsistent. We may be at 10. Daniel sat down. What do we do about the patients we haven't contacted yet? We contact them today, all of them. Every patient who had a procedure with Holt where device documentation is irregular gets a call today, regardless of whether we believe there's an actual implant issue. They deserve to know what we're looking for and why. Daniel nodded. Do it. There's a cost consideration. The imaging alone for 10 additional patients and the potential surgical interventions. I'll cover every dollar personally if the hospital's insurance carrier won't move fast enough. Cost is not the conversation we're having. Marsh looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Mr. Calloway, I've been a physician for 22 years. I've worked under 5 different administrations in 3 different hospitals. What your wife did, alone, without support, building that case while standing in those operating rooms, is the most consequential act of medical whistleblowing I have ever seen in this industry. Daniel didn't respond immediately. She'd tell you she was just doing her job, he finally said. I know. Marsh smiled briefly and tiredly. That's what makes it extraordinary. She turned back to her records, and Daniel walked out and down the hallway, and the hospital hummed around him with the particular energy of an institution that was in the process of being taken completely apart and rebuilt from the foundation, which is not a comfortable energy, but is sometimes the only honest one available. At 6:30 p.m. on Friday, exactly 33 hours after Sarah had walked into OR 7, a federal grand jury was convened in emergency session at the Dirksen Federal Building in downtown Chicago. Emergency grand juries were unusual. This one was warranted. Kowalski's team presented 3 hours of evidence: Core's full testimony, Linda Graves' statement, the complete financial documentation from the green folder, verified by independent forensic accountants, the security footage from 8 cameras in OR 7, the text message sent at 6:09 a.m. the previous morning, the Northfield biomedical connection, the patient impact evidence across 3 identified victims in Chicago and 1 in Phoenix. At 11:47 p.m., the grand jury returned an indictment, 51 counts, 12 counts of wire fraud, 9 counts of healthcare fraud, 7 counts of conspiracy, 5 counts of distributing adulterated and misbranded medical devices, 4 counts of money laundering, 2 counts of conducting unauthorized human subject research, 1 count of involuntary manslaughter for the death of Walter Grimes, 1 count of attempted murder, and a separate federal referral to Interpol for coordinated international charges related to the Northfield biomedical operation. 51 counts. When Craig Nolan received the indictment at 12:03 a.m. Saturday and reviewed the charge list, he sat in his car in the parking garage of his building and read it twice. Then he called his assistant and said he needed to clear his entire schedule for the foreseeable future. This was not a case that was going to resolve quietly. This was a case that was going to trial, and it was going to last a very long time. And by the time it was done, the name Gregory Holt was going to mean something in medical law that it would mean for the next 30 years. Daniel was back in Sarah's room when his phone lit up with Kowalski's message. 51 counts. He looked at it for a moment, then he turned the phone face down on the armrest and looked at his wife. She was asleep, and for the first time since Thursday morning, her face was doing something close to peaceful. The machine steady, the numbers on the monitors moving in the right direction, the worst of the immediate danger having passed in the last 12 hours into something still serious but no longer hourly critical. He leaned forward and spoke quietly into the space beside her ear. 51 counts, Sarah. The grand jury came back an hour ago. Her breathing didn't change. He hadn't expected it to. Walter Grimes is in it, by name, count 49, involuntary manslaughter. He paused. Carol Simmons is out of surgery. Arthur Brennan is going home tonight. Maria Delgado is scheduled for tomorrow morning in Phoenix. The FBI found Northfield, international referral to Interpol, 7 hospital sites, 4 countries. He stopped, sat back, looked at the ceiling. You did all of this with a laptop, a locked drawer, and 8 months of lunch breaks. His voice cracked very slightly on the last word. He pressed it back into evenness. And when you wake up all the way and you're ready to hear it, I'm going to tell you everything, every count, every name, every person who is going to have to stand in a courtroom and account for what they did. He took her hand. But right now, I just need you to keep doing what you're doing. The monitor beeped. Her chest rose and fell. Outside the window, Chicago was moving through its Friday night the way cities do, indifferent to the specific gravity of what had happened in one room, on one floor of one hospital, because cities don't know. They don't keep track of the individual moments when one person decides that being afraid is not a good enough reason to stay quiet. But the people inside that building knew, and by morning the rest of the country was about to find out. Saturday morning arrived the way consequential mornings sometimes do, quietly, with the particular stillness of a city that doesn't yet know what it's waking up to. By 7 a.m., the first news van was outside Mercy General. By 7:30, there were 6. By 8, there were satellite trucks from CNN, NBC, ABC, and the Washington Post had a reporter on a flight from D.C. who landed at O'Hare at 8:47 and was in the parking lot of the hospital by 9:15. The story had broken on the wire services at 6:22 a.m., fed by a leak from somewhere inside the federal building where the grand jury had returned its indictment 9 hours earlier. 51 counts, international connection, patients used as test subjects, a nurse, a green folder, a husband who owned the building. The combination was the kind of story that doesn't need amplification. It amplifies itself. Inside the ICU on the 4th floor, Sarah Calloway woke up to the sound of Daniel's voice reading to her from his phone. Not the news. He wasn't doing that to her yet. He was reading the text of a message from Rachel Torres in Washington, who had been awake since 4 in the morning, fielding calls from journalists, and had written to Daniel at 7:11 a.m. to say that the nonprofit she worked for was going to dedicate its next annual report entirely to what Sarah had done and what it meant for medical whistleblower protections nationwide. Sarah listened to the whole message with her eyes half open and then said, "Tell her thank you, and tell her to get some sleep." Daniel typed exactly that. Sarah's response when he read Rachel's reply back, which was a single laughing emoji, was the first real smile she had managed since Thursday morning. It lasted about 3 seconds before the movement pulled at something in her abdomen, and she stopped smiling and said something under her breath that was not suitable for broadcast. Daniel pretended not to hear it. "How's the pain?" "Manageable." "On a scale." "Daniel." 1 to 10, Sarah. She exhaled. 6, maybe 7 when I breathed too deep. He pressed the call button. The nurse came in, adjusted her medication, checked the drainage output, looked at the overnight vitals chart and said, "You are moving in the right direction, faster than we expected." Sarah said, "I'm a nurse. I know what that phrase means when you're trying to be encouraging without committing to anything." The nurse, a young woman named Jessica, who was 26 years old and had been on the floor for 14 months, looked at her for a moment and then said, "It means you're doing better than the odds suggested when you came in Thursday morning, and that everyone on this floor has been rooting for you since hour 1. Sarah looked at her. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it. It was 9:03 a.m. on Saturday. At 9:30, Thomas Reedy stood in front of the cluster of microphones outside Mercy General's main entrance, looking like a man who had rehearsed his statement 17 times and was still not confident in it. Mercy General Medical Center confirms that Dr. Gregory Holt has been removed from his position as Chief Executive Officer effective immediately. We are cooperating fully with all law enforcement agencies involved in this investigation. Our thoughts are with all patients and staff affected by recent events. He took 3 questions before retreating back inside, and the questions that chased him through the doors were the ones his statement had been specifically designed not to answer. Is it true the victim's husband owns the hospital? Is it true patients received unregistered medical devices without their consent? How many patients are we talking about? How long did the board know? Daniel watched the press conference on his phone from Sarah's room and then turned it off. Sarah had been watching it over his shoulder. The board didn't know, she said. Most of them. No, Daniel agreed. Most of them were just comfortable not asking questions when the numbers looked good. That's a different kind of failure. It is. He put the phone down. I'm calling a full board restructuring next week. New independent members. External appointment process. No one connected to Holt's tenure or his hiring committee stays in a governance role. Sarah looked at him. What about the hospital itself? The operations. The staff who had nothing to do with any of it, who showed up every day and did their jobs and had no idea what was happening around them. Dr. Marsh is staying on as permanent CMO. She asked me last night. I said yes without hesitation. Sarah nodded once. Good. She's the right person. I'm also setting up a patient advocacy fund. Every patient identified in the Holt device cases gets full coverage for all corrective procedures, follow-up care, and any associated legal costs, covered entirely by Stillwater Capital, not by the hospital's operating budget. The hospital's resources stay for patient care. Sarah was quiet for a moment. And David Morales. Daniel's expression shifted. He knew the name from the folder. The resident who had filed a formal compliance complaint 14 months earlier and been terminated 48 hours later via a fabricated drug test result. I've had my attorney reach out. He's been working at a clinic in Indiana since he lost his position here. We're offering reinstatement at full seniority level, a formal written apology from the board, and a settlement that accounts for the 14 months of career damage. Sarah's eyes filled. She blinked it back. He was 28 years old when they did that to him, she said. He did everything right. I know. He filed the report through the correct channel with the correct documentation, and the system destroyed him for it. Sarah, she stopped. Daniel looked at her. That's why the next thing I'm building inside this hospital is the thing that makes sure it never happens again. She held his gaze. Tell me. He told her. The independent ethics board with external members and subpoena power. The quarterly financial audits with published public results. The whistleblower protection fund seeded with $2 million from his personal accounts. The anonymous reporting hotline run by a third-party organization with a direct line bypassing hospital administration entirely. The procurement overhaul requiring dual authorization and independent verification on every purchase above $5,000. He had written it all out Friday night on a legal pad and hadn't stopped writing until dawn. Sarah listened to every word. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she said, "You wrote this in one night. You gathered evidence for 8 months while standing next to the man who wanted you dead. I think I can manage one night with a pen and some paper." She almost laughed. She stopped herself before the movement hurt. "Don't let the board water it down," she said. "Not one clause. Not one word," he said. "I promise." It was 10:41 a.m. and across town, Gregory Holt was meeting with Craig Nolan in a federal holding facility for the second time in less than 18 hours. And the meeting was not going well for either of them. Nolan had spent Friday night building what he believed was a workable defense architecture. The stabbing, he planned to argue, was the result of acute psychological decompensation triggered by surgical stress, a one-time breakdown in a man with no history of violence, occurring under circumstances of extreme professional pressure. It was thin, but it was something. Then he had received the indictment, 51 counts, the Northfield connection, the international referral, the 3 patient device cases with documented physical harm. He had read it in his car at midnight, and the defense architecture he had been building quietly collapsed. Because you cannot argue psychological decompensation as a mitigating factor in a 51-count federal indictment that includes unauthorized human subject experimentation and a voluntary business relationship with a German pharmaceutical conglomerate spanning 18 months. Holt listened to Nolan explain the landscape of the charges across the table. He was wearing civilian clothes now, the surgical gown long gone, and he sat with his hands folded on the table in a posture that was still attempting to project composure and achieving something closer to vacancy. When Nolan finished, Holt said, "What are our realistic options?" Nolan chose his words carefully. "Our realistic options are to negotiate the best possible plea arrangement in exchange for cooperation on the Northfield investigation, or to go to trial on all 51 counts with the understanding that we will be doing so against a case that includes video evidence, 3 cooperating witnesses, a forensic paper trail covering 32 months, 3 patients with documented physical harm, and an international criminal conspiracy charge." Holt said, "And if we go to trial?" "If we go to trial, Gregory, I will defend you to the absolute limit of my ability, and you will very likely spend the rest of your functional life in federal prison." The room was quiet. Holt looked at his hands. He looked at them for a long time. Then he said something that Nolan had not expected. "The nurse, how is she?" Nolan blinked. "I don't have current information." "She was good at her job," Holt said. His voice was flat, empty in the specific way of a man who has stripped everything out of it deliberately, because if anything is left in it, it will betray him. She was the best surgical nurse on that floor. I knew that. I knew it when I read her file, and I knew it when I was watching her work. That's the part that He stopped. Nolan waited. Holt didn't finish the sentence. He looked back at his hands. "Tell them I'll cooperate on Northfield," he said. "Everything I know. All of it." Nolan nodded slowly. "I'll make the call this morning." It was 11:14 a.m. on Saturday, and 2 miles away, Kowalski was already on the phone with the Interpol liaison in Lyon. The Northfield cooperation offer from Holt's attorney arrived at the federal prosecutor's office at 11:52 a.m. The prosecutors reviewed it for 22 minutes and then called Kowalski. She listened, asked 3 questions and said, "Tell them we'll discuss terms after we've verified the scope of what he can actually provide. Cooperation on Northfield doesn't reduce the domestic charges. It factors into sentencing. Those are not the same thing." She hung up and called Daniel. "Holt is offering to cooperate on the Northfield International investigation." Daniel was quiet for 2 seconds. "What does that mean for the domestic case?" "Nothing changes. 51 counts stand. His sentencing range may be affected by cooperation, but that's a conversation for after conviction. What it means for the Northfield investigation is that we may be able to move significantly faster on the international side." Holt was their primary U.S. contact. He knows names, transfer mechanisms, communication protocols. He knows which of the other 6 hospital sites were run the same way his was. Daniel stood up from the chair beside Sarah's bed and walked to the window. "How many total patients across all 7 sites?" "Our current estimate, based on preliminary coordination with the relevant national authorities, is somewhere between 60 and 90 patients who may have received Northfield devices without their knowledge. That number is going to change as we dig deeper." 60 to 90 patients. Daniel pressed his hand flat against the window frame. "The same thing that happened to Carol Simmons." "Potentially, yes. Some of the devices appear to have been different models at different sites, but the methodology was consistent." Northfield identified hospitals with financial vulnerabilities, recruited administrators with existing ethical deficits, and ran their unauthorized trials through the surgical programs. She paused. Sarah didn't just expose what was happening at Mercy General. She pulled the thread that unravels a 6-year international operation. Daniel turned away from the window and looked at his wife. She was watching him. She had heard enough of his side of the call to understand the shape of what was being said. He held her gaze and said to Kowalski, "Tell me what you need from this end to move the international case forward." Kowalski told him. He wrote it down. He made 3 calls before noon. It was 12:30 p.m. on Saturday. The story had been running on cable news for 6 hours and showed no sign of slowing. James Whitmore, the firefighter from Evanston, who had been on the operating table in OR 7 when everything happened, woke up from his medically induced recovery coma at 1:15 p.m. His wife Carol was beside him. He looked at her face and said, "Tell me." She told him. She took his hand and told him everything, the same way she had lived through it, not with clinical detachment, but with the shaking voice of a woman who had spent 48 hours not knowing if her husband was going to come home. When she finished, James lay there for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "The nurse, is she alive?" "Yes, she's on the 4th floor." "I want to see her." Carol shook her head gently. "James, you just came out of—" "Carol," his voice was quiet, "a woman was stabbed 5 times in the middle of my surgery. While I was on the table, she was trying to help save my life when that happened." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I don't care how long it takes or how hard the walk is. I am going to walk into that woman's room and I am going to shake her hand." Carol looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll ask the doctor when you're cleared to walk." He was cleared 4 days later. He made the walk slowly, one hand on the corridor wall, Carol 2 steps behind him. He knocked on the door of Sarah's room. Daniel opened it. The two men looked at each other for a moment without speaking. Then Daniel stepped aside and James Whitmore walked in and looked at the woman in the bed. Sarah looked back at him. She had been briefed that morning on who was coming. She was sitting up fully now, the color mostly back in her face. 7 days past the surgery, and 4 past the point where the doctors had stopped using phrases like secondary risk. James stopped beside the bed. He extended his hand. She took it. He held it for a long time. "I don't know what to say," he finally said. "I was unconscious, and you were the one bleeding." Sarah said, "Dr. Walsh saved your life. I just handed her the tools." James shook his head. "You were in that room doing your job when a man with a scalpel turned on you. And according to my wife, the first coherent thing you asked when you woke up was whether I was alive." Sarah didn't answer. "I've been a firefighter for 30 years, James said. His voice was steady, but something underneath it was not. "I have run into burning buildings for strangers. I thought I understood what it meant to put someone else first. But I want you to know that what you did, not just Thursday morning, but all of it, the 8 months, the folder, the evidence, all of it, it is the bravest thing I have ever heard of in my life." Sarah's eyes filled. She pressed her lips together. "Thank you," she said, "for coming." He nodded. He didn't let go of her hand for another moment. Then he did, and he turned, and Carol guided him back out of the room, and Daniel quietly closed the door. It was Saturday afternoon, and 4 months later, in a federal courtroom in downtown Chicago, the trial of Gregory Holt began. It lasted 14 days. The prosecution called 26 witnesses. Sarah Calloway was the 8th. She walked into the courtroom on a Tuesday morning wearing a gray blazer over a white blouse, her hair pulled back, her posture controlled and precise. She was thinner than she had been before the attack. She moved carefully, carrying the specific physical awareness of someone who has had 5 wounds repaired and knows exactly where each of them lives. She sat in the witness box, raised her right hand, and swore to tell the truth. For 3 hours and 40 minutes, she did exactly that. She described the missing supplies, the forged invoices, the shell companies, Walter Grimes's death, the 7 unregistered device surgeries, the 4 months of investigation conducted alone during lunch breaks and overnight hours using legitimate access and publicly available records. She described the morning of the attack, walking into OR 7, handing Holt the scalpel, the half-second before he moved, when she understood, falling to the floor, Janet's hands pressing against the wounds, the green folder, home. She said all of it in a level voice that did not shake, and the courtroom was completely silent for the entire time she was speaking. The specific silence that fills a room when everyone in it understands they are hearing something that is going to matter long after today. Craig Nolan's cross-examination lasted 40 minutes. He questioned her motives, suggested financial interest, implied her husband's ownership position gave her incentive to manufacture evidence against a CEO who might otherwise have been an obstacle to Daniel's control of the institution. Sarah looked at him and said, "I kept my investigation entirely secret from my husband for 8 months. I never used his name, his resources, or his access. I did this because a 68-year-old grandfather died on a table I was standing beside, and the valve in his chest was a recalled piece of equipment that your client sourced from a secondary broker to save $40 per unit. That is my motive. That is the only motive I have ever had." Nolan did not ask another question. Linda Graves testified on day 5. She described the culture of fear, the buried reports, the destroyed careers, and the cracked office door, and the words she had heard through it. She cried twice on the stand. The jury watched every second. Dennis Cower testified on day 7. He laid out the entire operation from the inside with the flat, exhausted precision of a man who has decided that the only thing left worth protecting is the truth. When the prosecutor asked why he was testifying, Cower looked at the table in front of him for a moment. Then he said, "Because a woman who had nothing to gain and everything to lose did what the rest of us in that building were too afraid to do. And the least I can do is make sure the record is complete." The jury deliberated for 5 hours and 11 minutes. Guilty on all 51 counts. The courtroom erupted. Beverly Grimes in the 4th row covered her face with both hands. James Whitmore in the 6th row put his arm around his wife. Carol Simmons, seated beside Arthur Brennan 3 rows back, closed her eyes and exhaled so slowly it looked like she had been holding that breath for months. Because she had. Sarah sat perfectly still. She held Daniel's hand and looked straight ahead, and the noise of the room washed over her, and she felt what she had not allowed herself to feel for a very long time. Not victory, not relief, something quieter and more permanent than either. The knowledge that it had been worth it. Every day of the 8 months, every document, every lunch break spent cross-referencing invoice numbers instead of eating. Every morning she had smiled at Gregory Holt in the corridor and said, "Good morning," and kept walking and kept working and kept building the case 1 page at a time. It had been worth all of it. The sentencing came 6 weeks later. The federal judge, a woman named Margaret Hollis, who had spent 28 years on the bench and had seen the full inventory of what human beings could do to one another in pursuit of money and power, looked at Gregory Holt across the courtroom and spoke for 11 minutes. She covered every count, every victim, Walter Grimes by name, Carol Simmons, Arthur Brennan, Maria Delgado, the 63 patients across 7 countries whose bodies had been used as instruments of an unauthorized research program because Northfield Biomedical had identified their hospitals as financially vulnerable, and Gregory Holt had said yes to the arrangement and cashed the checks. She noted that Holt had cooperated meaningfully with the Interpol investigation, which had resulted in the arrest of 7 Northfield executives across 3 countries, the shutdown of the entire trial program, and the identification of all 63 affected patients, all of whom were now receiving coordinated medical care. She noted it. She did not treat it as mitigation. She sentenced him to 24 years in federal prison. Holt was 55 years old. He would be 79 if he served it fully. He was led out of the courtroom without looking at anyone in the gallery. The door closed behind him, and the chapter that had started with a scalpel and a lie and a green folder in a locked desk drawer was finished. But the story wasn't. Stories like this one don't end with a sentencing. They keep moving in the people they changed, in the structures they broke open and rebuilt, in the lives that were altered permanently by one person's decision to stay when every rational instinct said go. David Morales got the call from Daniel's attorney on a Wednesday afternoon while he was finishing a double shift at the clinic in Indiana. He sat in his car for 20 minutes before driving home. He accepted the reinstatement, the apology, and the settlement. He was back at Mercy General within 2 months. On his first day back, he stopped outside the door of the Ethics Board office, which now occupied the corner suite that had once been Gregory Holt's, and he stood there for a moment. Then he went to work. The Parker Reform Structure, as the medical community began calling it, spread faster than anyone in the building had anticipated. Within 8 months of its implementation at Mercy General, 11 hospitals across 6 states had requested copies of the governance framework. Within a year, a version of the anonymous reporting protocol had been adopted as a voluntary standard by a national hospital accreditation body. The Whistleblower Protection Fund model was cited in 3 separate pieces of proposed federal legislation. The Green Folder, as a concept, entered the vocabulary of medical ethics seminars nationwide, shorthand for the idea that one person with legitimate access, careful documentation, and the courage to use both could dismantle something enormous. Sarah went back to work 16 months after the attack. She came back as a nurse. She did not come back as a symbol or a spokesperson or a consultant or a public figure. She came back to the surgical floor at 6:45 a.m. on a Monday morning in her scrubs, with her badge, and she checked the board and took her assignments and went to work. The only thing that was different was that when she walked down the hallway now, people looked at her with something they couldn't quite hide. Not admiration exactly, closer to the specific recognition that passes between people who have been through something real and know what it cost. She requested OR7 for the first time 19 months after the attack. She had not been assigned to it since Thursday. Not officially, not by her own request. She had kept telling herself it was coincidence and had eventually stopped pretending. On a Tuesday morning, she put the request in herself, and the charge nurse approved it without comment. She stood in the doorway for a moment when she arrived. A young surgical tech named Marcus was prepping equipment on the far side of the room. He looked up and saw her in the doorway and went very still for a second. "Mrs. Calloway," she walked in. "Let's get the room ready," she said. He moved immediately. She went to her instrument tray and began the pre-procedure checklist, the same way she had done it 10,000 times. Every item confirmed, every serial number verified, every device cross-referenced against the safety database that she herself had helped design and that now covered every piece of equipment in every surgical suite in the building. The patient that morning was a 61-year-old woman named Grace Navarro, retired kindergarten teacher, mother of 3, grandmother of 7, scheduled for a valve replacement. A recalled-free, database-confirmed, fully verified valve replacement. Sarah checked it twice. She checked everything twice now, not out of fear, but out of the deep professional certainty that the details are where lives are saved or lost, and that someone in this room needed to be the person who never looked away from the details. Always. The surgeon walked in. The anesthesiologist took position. The monitors started their steady rhythm. Sarah picked up the first instrument. Her hands were completely steady. She had always known they would be, because that is what this story is, at its foundation. Underneath the fraud in the courtroom, in the handcuffs, in the 51 counts, in the 24 years. It is the story of a woman who saw something wrong and decided that being afraid was not a sufficient reason to be silent, who documented the truth in a green folder, in a locked drawer, and carried it to work every day for 8 months, alongside the man who wanted her dead, who paid for that courage with 5 stab wounds and nearly her life, and who came back. Not because it was easy, not because the world rewarded her appropriately, or the system worked the way it was supposed to, or the people in power did the right thing. She came back because the work was real, and the patients were real, and the truth she had protected was real. And once you have protected something real at that cost, you do not walk away from it. You go back in, you pick up the instrument, you do the job. Because power can intimidate, and corruption can hide, and fear can paralyze an entire institution into silence for years. But one person with a locked drawer in 8 months of lunch breaks and the specific, unshakable conviction that the truth deserves to survive can bring all of it down. That is not a lesson. That is not a sentiment. That is exactly what happened.